an introduction very briefly in terms of the Green Party. Our new slogan, we've only recently unveiled it, is for the common good. And what we're seeking to achieve really is a society in which everybody has sufficient for a decent quality of life, but we're living within the planetary limits of the one planet that we have. Because at the moment in Britain, collectively, we all each year use the resources of 3 planets, but we only have one. So going back a bit to the everybody having sufficient for a decent life, we think it's an absolute disgrace that Britain is the 6th richest country in the world, and yet we have 1 in 5 workers, 20% of workers are on less than a living wage. They're not actually paid enough money to keep a roof over their heads, to put food on the table, to pay the energy bills. And of course, one of the things that there's been a lot of publicity about, and I visit a lot of quite often, is food banks. Food banks is one of our fastest growing industries. And we believe that no one should have to rely on charity for food. We need decent wages and decent benefits for everybody who needs them. And that means really that we need jobs that you can build a life on. One of the things I campaign a lot on is against 0 hours contracts. Because this means, and it's interesting because with the very young audience, I just say 0 hours contracts and everyone nods. If I go and talk to a sort of a very much older audience, I have to explain what 0 hours contracts are, because they are very much something that younger people coming into the workforce are finding is often the only thing available to them. And yet, how can you actually build a life if one week maybe you get some kind of decent wage and the next week you get 0? And how do you plan, how do you organise your life? And you're certainly not going to build up the kind of reserves that would enable you to cope with that under that sort of scenario. So that's the sort of things that, in terms of people having enough resources for a decent life. I also spend inevitably a lot of time talking about energy policy. And actually earlier today, I was in Worley looking at this wonderful project to have a community-owned generating scheme to generate electricity from the river, an Archimedes screw for those who like the technical side of things. And that's the kind of thing that we need to do, is generate our energy from that and not fracking, which I know is a big issue around here and perhaps we might talk about. But the other thing, the big missing thing from energy policy is energy conservation, particularly warm, comfortable homes. And I'll bet some of you with student accommodation will know exactly what I mean when I say £1 in 4 that we spend across the country is wasted in terms of trying to heat our homes, because it goes straight up through an uninsulated ceiling or through a drafty door or window. And what we'd like to see is the energy bill revolution, which is a proposal put forward by NGOs and charities that would take the money that the government gets from carbon taxes and put it into insulating all of our homes that need them. And what that could do over a couple of decades is take 9 out of 10 households out of fuel poverty, create up to 200,000 jobs, and of course cut carbon emissions. And that sort of takes me to the other side in terms of living within the limits of one planet. I doubt there's anyone in this room who needs to be told that last year we had the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change put out a report that really ended, or should have ended, any scientific debate about is climate change real, is it happening, is it here now? 97% of climate scientists agree. The fact is there, the statistics are there. This is actually the most examined science in history. If you think about how much this is all being pored over, scientists from all around the globe, we have to act on climate change. But when we're thinking about environmental issues, it isn't just climate change. Because my first degree is agricultural science, I have a rather geeky interest in soils, and the quality of our soils is just plummeting at an enormous rate. The quality of our fresh water, the quality of our oceans, and particularly our biodiversity, are all going down very fast. And I think I was actually speaking at the Student Assembly Against Austerity in London late last year, and I started there, and I always feel with audiences like this, like I should say, on behalf of my generation, sorry, we've made a right mess of things, and we're leaving it to you to sort it out. But on that score, I would say to you, I'd urge everyone to get involved in politics in some way or another, whether it's signing a petition, whether it's retweeting something political, whether it's getting involved in an issue, whether it's getting involved in a party, and above all, please do vote. I'm not going to say vote green, I'm just going to say vote. Because if you don't vote, what you get counted in is the people who are happy enough with the thing as things are, so they're not going to bother to go and vote. So do go and vote every chance you get, and if you don't like any of the options on the ballot paper, at least go into the polling station and write a rude word on the ballot paper. Then you won't get counted in the, oh, I'm happy enough with how things are society. So, I'm really looking forward to the questions. I won't talk for too long, but I do want to very much deliver that message. Your local council, Westminster, Brussels, that's where the decisions get made. You really need to have a say in who's making those decisions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I think what we'll do with this, we'll obviously open the floor for questions. We'll start off with anything around green or environmental issues to start with, and then we'll move on to other areas. I'll start with the question from here actually, and that with the survey we did, it was 882 students. I found that. And 65.3% of those surveyed said they would like to do more to help the environment. So I was just going to start with the question of what would you suggest they do as a starting point?
Right. Well, I think there's lots of obvious ones, from switching the lights off to recycling to trying to cut down on your use of recyclable cups. I don't always manage it, but I do carry around one of these, which is quite good, and you can end up accumulating lots of things like that. But what I would stress is that it's very difficult. Individual actions are useful, but individual actions are not what I'm primarily concerned about, because we can all individually do all the right thing, but just the way our society is organised makes it impossible for us to cut our carbon emissions to the level we need to, makes it impossible to live within that one planet limits. So, one of the most green things you can do is campaign to change things. Your own individual actions make some difference, and it's worth doing what you can, although I'd also say don't beat yourself up when sometimes, you can't do quite the right thing and you just go for the other option. Because sometimes you just have to. But, get involved in campaigns to change things, because one of the factors is, and this is true of both economic sustainability and environmental sustainability, the way things are now is not going to continue. We are going to see very significant radical change, because where we are now is not sustainable. And we need to make sure that change happens in the right direction, not in the wrong direction.
Okay, thank you. Right, okay, we'll open the questions out to the floor. Does anyone have a question around green or environmental, sustainable?
Yep.
A lot of people have the perception that the Green Party only has policies surrounding sustainable energy and stuff like that. What kind of policies do you have for education and housing?
Okay, education, I'll start with the very obvious one, which is higher education. We believe in zero tuition fees. Big fat zero, I'll draw for effect at this point. And because we believe that education is a public good, you're benefiting from the education you're getting, but the whole of society is benefiting from the fact that you are educated. And what we don't want to see is a situation where many students who are starting university now are going to be leaving with something like a £55,000 weight of debt sitting on their shoulder. And it really annoys me when you get people saying, and particularly Lib Dems, apologies to any Lib Dems in the room, if there are any left, in universities anyway. But lots of people say, oh, it's all right, because most people will never pay it back. And so that means most people leaving university are going to go through 30 years of their life with that weight of debt sitting on their shoulder, seeing 9% of their income ground away year after year. All those years when you normally expect to be, thinking about perhaps settling down, maybe having children, maybe buying a house, you're going to see that weight of debt there weighing you down. And also it's going to really force people to make decisions in terms of looking at, well, there's that job over there that doesn't pay very well but really fits my skills and ability and is what I'd like to do. But there's this higher paying job over there, and if I do that I can pay the debt off and then feel like I'm free to really start my life. And people shouldn't be forced into that kind of choice. People should be choosing the right job for them. And so, I think student debt is a huge issue that is going to have huge impacts on society that really hasn't been thought through at all. In terms of broader education policies, I'm actually a school governor at a primary school in London, and it frustrates me enormously to see just how much the education system has been turned into a sausage machine as a way of forcing people through the next exam and the next exam and the next exam just endlessly, and teachers are forced into teaching for the test. You know, the whole focus is not to develop your skills and knowledge and ability to learn, but hey, you know, can you get through the next exam, and have you practiced enough for the next exam, and do you know have the right technique for the next exam? And that is, you know, really the wrong way to educate people. And in terms of structures, in terms of schools, we're utterly opposed to free schools and academies. We believe in local comprehensive schools that serve local communities. And ideally, wherever, certainly in urban areas, it should be a local school that you can walk or cycle to. And you know, that means then the school serves the community and is an absolute hub of the community. I mean, I visited in Red Hill in Surrey, which is an area that's got lots of big new commuter developments. I was talking to some people on the street there, and they were saying they built this whole new suburb, but there's no school. And so the children on this street, you know, the children in that house go to that school, the next house down they go to that school, the next house down they go to that school. And none of the parents know each other because they don't meet each other through the school. So local community schools are, you know, a really important issue for us.
Okay. Off the back of the sort of going back to the higher education side of things, you talked about going to zero tuition fees. How would you start that process if the Green Party was successful in the next election?
Okay. Well, the question I'm always asked is how do we pay for it? And my short answer for that is make the rich and multinational companies pay their taxes. You know, there's huge, enormous tax avoidance. There's very low rates of tax. We have a situation where simply the rich and the multinational companies are just scooping off the wealth from our society. And people still feel like, well, I don't really understand how you can pay for this, but what I can do is go back to our 2010 general election manifesto, and that had zero tuition fees in it, and it was a fully costed manifesto, our first fully costed manifesto. And I can prove, or I can show to you that it did add up, because I was involved a little bit in writing it. And Channel 4 thought it was interesting that we had a costed manifesto. And so they actually went through and checked all the figures, and they came back to us with some questions, and we answered those questions. And Channel 4, their researchers, they found that it added up. And they didn't do a story about it, because the manifesto adding up isn't interesting. They were only interested in doing a story if it didn't add up. So, you know, it is possible, financially possible to do this. It just requires a substantial, you know, tackling of inequality in our society, which would actually be a good thing to do anyway.
Thank you. Any questions? We'll just open up to any questions for any sort of policies. Yeah.
Talking around Green and Green Party, we've still got Green Party here now. Do you think it's maybe right and appropriate that on elected councils and universities and paid positions and student unions that the Green voice is represented by a Green member? So that those.
I think very much so. I mean, the Green Party as a whole is growing very fast. We've doubled our membership in the past 7 years. But we're particularly growing in terms of young green groups around the country. And one of the ones that I'm particularly proud of, although I don't quite know what's happened, I haven't been down there yet, is Plymouth University, where we started up for the first time, got more than 100 people signed up in the first week, and we're apparently now the only political society on campus. So, you know, and we have had situations where LSE, for example, a few years ago, we were the largest political group on campus, and the student president was a Green Party member. So I would very much encourage people to go forward and do this, because it's also very useful in terms of people, you know, being able to see and understand that Green is one of the choices on the political menu. It's available to you at university and beyond university.
Okay, thank you. There's a question in the
Yes,
back.
you brought up the issue of fracking earlier, as well as the issue of joblessness in sort of postgraduates. Fracking, as I see it, will bring in a lot of jobs into the job market, not only in the engineering side of things, but in accounting and in the regulatory bodies. So would there be any sort of compromise between getting rid of fracking and also bringing in this new injection of free jobs?
Well, I think the reality is that any kind of, we need new forms of energy generation in Britain. We're rightly closing down the coal-fired power stations, the old nuclear is coming to the end of their life. And whatever we replace that with will create jobs. That's inevitable. But it's a question of what type of jobs and what we're doing with those jobs are doing. Now, certainly fracking would create jobs, but so also would, for example, tidal energy. There's a plan which the building application will go into, the planning application will go in the next few months to build the first of what are planned to be 5 tidal lagoons, and this one is in Cardiff Bay. And this is technology that's proven, but it has never been developed on a very large scale. And the idea is that we should actually develop this whole new industry in Britain. So we should do the design work here, we should manufacture the turbines here, we should create the whole new. The proposal is for the first one planned for Cardiff Bay. They've got a 74% British content of the technology that's being used, all the material that's going into it. Now, that's creating a whole new industry that Britain could be leading the world in, that could be creating a whole lot of great design jobs, engineer jobs, technology jobs, computer jobs. Whereas if you compare that, say, to fracking, we would be using basically entirely American technology. Most of the experts coming in would be American. The technology, most of the drilling rigs, etc., the key bits will be manufactured in America. So you actually look at the number of jobs and the quality of jobs that would be created for fracking versus, say, tidal, or indeed offshore wind, the same arguments apply. So, and this is an argument that I think you never see done, and it really is a question that everyone should be asking. When something new is proposed and they say, oh, this is going to create hundreds and hundreds of jobs, say, what kind of jobs are they? Are we talking about lorry driver jobs, which a lot of fracking jobs would be, or are we talking about engineering, high-tech type jobs? And also ask about, if we made a similar investment in a different thing, would that create more jobs? So, for example, I was talking also about energy conservation, which is one alternative to actually generating new energy. And energy conservation creates lots and lots of jobs, because the job of going from house to house, insulating homes, fixing up homes to a high quality is a high job generation by its nature. So it's very similar to, you'll often find supermarkets come into towns and cities and say, we're going to create 200 new jobs. But ask the question, how many small businesses, small shops are going to close down because their supermarkets arrive? So whenever someone presents you the jobs argument, ask some critical questions. It might be that the answers are fine, but you do need to make sure those critical questions have been asked.
Okay, thank you. Question just behind you.
I just wanted to go back to what you were saying about schools, and you seem to be talking about a dislike to time control and things like that, and also you were talking about bringing up the bottom and also taxing more highly at the top. It seems like all these things are very anti sort of neoliberal,
Yeah, I would definitely describe myself as anti-neoliberal.
Yeah. Does that mean then in effect that you want to grow Britain again and you want to introduce more regulation again, or is this kind of a new neoliberalism, or where are we on the ideology?
Well, basically, what we're not suggesting is any kind of command and control economy, any kind of that centralised kind of system. What we really believe in is localism, local decisions being made locally by the people most affected. So if you think of the kind of economy we're imagining an economy mainly made up of small businesses and cooperatives, and strong local economies where money goes round and round in the local economy. And to sort of demonstrate in a practical sense how this works, if you think about a £1 bag of apples, if you go and buy that in your nearest Tesco or Sainsbury's or whatever, very likely you'll be pushed to buy it through a self-service till where you have one staff member on a minimum wage, quite likely 0 hours contract, tending to 6 tills. If you think about how much of that £1 of your apples you're buying actually stays here in Preston, it's a tiny, tiny fraction. Very likely the apples will come from South Africa or New Zealand. Very likely, if that store wants new signs, new fittings, they use a national contractor. If you contrast that to, if you're lucky enough to still have a local greengrocer, that local greengrocer, perhaps she buys her apples from the orchard down the road. She employs local people who are her friends as well as her employees, so she's unlikely to employ them on a 0 hours contract with horrible minimum wage conditions. When she needs some new shelves, she gets a local carpenter in. When she needs a new sign, she gets a local sign writer in. So what you do is restore strong local economies where money goes round and round, built on small businesses. And you know, the local greengrocer doesn't usually have sort of 16 subsidiaries in the Cayman Islands where all of her profits are mysteriously made. And so you actually keep money going round and round in towns, creates a range of jobs. You know, one of the things she'll do is employ a local accountant to do her tax. So that's the kind of economy, very locally based, very strongly based on local food production, local manufacturing, local jobs.
But what's coming from, where's the government controlling this?
Well, what the government is doing is, what neoliberalism has done, has created an open slather whereby big multinational companies have been able to demolish all of those levels of small business. So what we effectively want to do is level the playing field. Say multinational companies, and like a good example for this is Amazon. You might have noticed there's been a lot of attacks on Amazon recently in terms of the way they treat their staff, which is about as close to slave labour as you can get without actually being slave labour. They don't pay any taxes, and they're wiping out small businesses left, right and centre. And if you force big companies to simply be decent corporate citizens, like make the minimum wage a living wage, ban 0 hours contracts, then you level the playing field that allows those small businesses and cooperatives to thrive. So it's not a case of telling them what to do, it's just giving them a chance.
Okay, thank you. Kind of red coat.
Let's talk about education. You said rather than having students go from exam to exam, just constantly exam, how would you change the system to make it not just about exams? How would you change the system?
Cut the number of exams to start off with. And one of the things we'd like to do too is at the moment we have the earliest starting age for school in Europe, and we have some of the poorest results on things like literacy and numeracy at 11. We'd like school to start later, that's a case of formal schooling rather than necessarily, you can still have childcare and good quality facilities that children can go to, but not forcing into that formal schooling. Eliminate all of the tests, the SAT tests and that through primary school. And you would still get reports from teachers going home, and you would still check on progress, but not in the sense of individual children being shoved through the system. I mean, I know what it's like as a school governor. We end up sometimes with the whole school practically focused on, we've got to get these 4 pupils up to level 4. And practically the whole school is just focused on trying to get those, whereas what you want to do is develop each child to the maximum potential. And so take away the exams and basically trust teachers to be professionals, to do the best they possibly can for the children. And just understand that there's lots of different skills and abilities, and exams, I used to be really good at exams, and I think exams test how well you do exams. I don't think they really test anything else very useful at all.
Okay, thank you. And there's a question there. Yeah, sorry.
Given that green issues are very high in public consciousness, probably never been higher, and millions of people, it's a crucial issue. Why do you think thus far the party's presence in Parliament in terms of MPs has been extremely low? Do you think that's going to change anytime soon?
In short, the answer to that is the first past the post electoral system. Because the reality is, if you take, for example, the 1989 European election, when the European election was still on first past the post, we got 15% vote across the whole country, and not a single seat. And that's been the situation also in terms of general elections. That's where we'll be. But we are actually now in a very different position to what we've ever been before, because in 2010 we elected Caroline Lucas as the first Green MP in Brighton Pavilion. And that means 2015 as a general election is different to any general election we've fought before, because before people would say, oh, Greens never get elected, it's a wasted vote, no point in voting Green. But now we can say to any seat in the country, be it in Preston, be it in anywhere else, well, Brighton Pavilion did it, you can do it too.
Any questions over this side? So. Yes.
I just follow up on that. Clearly, in the past elections, general elections, anyway, not in local elections, you've not put up enough candidates to have them won everywhere. And I presume that tax philosophy? Are you concentrating on those seats you want to win in order to get some more wins rather than trying to cover the country with the option for everyone to vote Green? I don't expect that I'll get a chance to vote Green this afternoon.
Well, it's not philosophy, it's poverty. Because general elections, you have to put a £500 deposit up for each seat. And if you do the maths of £500 times 650, it adds up to what by Green Party standards is an awfully large amount of money. You know, we don't get money from big corporate sponsors, we don't get money from the city. Our money basically by and large comes from our members. And so for members, you know, in lots of parts of the country, and usually it's the local party because we have a decentralised structure, I can't tell anyone in the country to do anything. Each local party is sovereign in deciding what it wants to do. So that local party has to decide if it's going to spend that £500 on that, or very often what they'll be doing instead is focusing on trying to win, say, one council seat. And so it's a decision that's made locally. I mean, last time we stood in more than half the seats. I would expect that this time we'll increase that number by how much we'll see in 6 months or so. But my answer would always be, you know, and people come to me, particularly on Twitter, but all over the place and say, you know, I haven't got someone green to vote for, I don't like that. My answer is basically, maybe you could be that candidate in the Ribble Valley.
Which is exactly what I did. I spent 10 years going to my local junior school every year wanting to vote for anybody green, and every year I thought, bloody hell, I'm just going to have to do it myself. And 2 years ago I did, and I ran for election twice. Only on a paper candidate though, which meant it didn't cost anything.
And for the council, you can do that. For the general election,
No,
£500.
absolutely. But in terms of local politics, you know, if you're disappointed with what is available to you, stand. Whoever your main party is, stand for them. You know, it costs nothing.
Okay, thanks. Pete?
I'm not a student, but I'm actually involved in politics. How does it feel when Nigel Farage, who hasn't got an MP in Parliament, seems to be on every media channel all the time, and you don't seem to be able to get the coverage?
Yeah.
Are you jealous, or annoyed,
yes.
or are you? And do you make representations about it? Because I'm sick of the sight of him.
Yes, and you'll actually see the result of some of this representation on Sunday when some people who follow politics quite closely may have seen that Sunday Politics last week did what amounted to a party political broadcast for UKIP. Well, this week they're doing one for the Green Party. But to take that, sort of look at that in a broader sense, I think I've always been asked, why aren't you doing as well as UKIP? And first of all, it's worth saying that there's a very tiny percentage of voters who, when they go into the ballot box, are sort of going, oh, UKIP or Green, UKIP or Green. But they're not very many of them. And so the people who are voting for UKIP are not, by and large, people who will vote for us. And the rise of UKIP is a function of general dissatisfaction of right-wing voters, both Tories and right-wing Labour people, with the state of things in their traditional parties. And that's not something that we can actually really do anything very much about. We have to convince our own voters, people who are likely to vote for us. And the other thing is that, I'm a former journalist. I used to be editor of The Guardian Weekly, the international edition of The Guardian. And so I do actually understand that if people go out and say really mad things, they get covered. It makes good press. And I will admit that I have actually seriously considered sometimes going out and saying mad things just so I can get covered. But we're actually a serious political party. We have a program, we have policies democratically agreed by the members. We are, for example, running the Brighton and Hove Green Council. We're the official opposition in Norwich. We're aiming to actually govern and do things. And that doesn't square with going around saying mad things.
Thanks. I have a question here actually from a member of university staff. Here at UCLan we have a large sort of contingent of students going into the healthcare profession. One of them as a staff is asking, in light of the National Health Action Party being developed in the recent years, what does the party intend to do about the NHS election?
Well, there's, in terms of the things that I regularly say, sort of almost like a mantra, making the minimum wage a living wage, renationalising the railways, and a publicly owned and publicly run NHS is the third thing on that list of mantra. we absolutely don't believe that the profit principle has any place in healthcare. If you look at the American healthcare system, they spend twice what we do as a percentage of GDP for much worse outcomes. It's an utterly disastrous model that doesn't stack up on any international comparisons, and yet we're racing towards it at an absolute rate of knots. So we're absolutely opposed to the private sector involvement in the NHS. We do everything possible to reverse it as fast as possible and certainly stop it going any further. The NHS Action Party, I'm a bit frustrated they exist. They will take some votes off us. I'm afraid they're not going to get elected anywhere. And if you want people who are going to be in Parliament speaking up for the NHS, and this is a particularly important issue in terms of the European elections, because many people might know that there's at the moment negotiations going on for the EU-US free trade deal, and there's a potential to be written into that a whole lot of legislation that would basically mean once you privatise something in the NHS, it's utterly impossible to renationalise it. And it's really important to have MEPs in Europe fighting against that. And the MEPs in Europe fighting against that are the Green MEPs. And on that point, it's a useful point that many people don't know is that the Green group in Europe is the fourth largest group in the European Parliament. We have a very significant number of people, decent number of staff, different resources. And you might like to know that the Tories actually belong to the fifth largest group. So they're rather less significant than us in Britain.
Thank you.
Moving on from what you said, question there. What do you stand with regard to everything that's going on at the moment for those?
Basic position on Europe, in short, is 3 yeses. We say yes to remaining in Europe, very much so, because Europe, we believe, provides a foundation of decent standards, a foundation of standards on workers' rights, on social rights, on consumer rights. Okay, they didn't do great on horse meat, but hey, they can do better than that. Environmental standards, human rights standards, and Europe is really important to provide those standards, and it means that neighbouring countries in Europe can't undercut each other. If you have a situation, as we see, for example, in tax, where we'd like to see rules harmonising as well, the Irish desperately undercut everyone on tax, and you have a situation whereby, somehow or other, if you buy a Facebook ad here in Britain, it goes through Ireland, the accounting, and it goes through the Irish tax system, not the British tax system. And so Europe helps to provide and can provide more of basic foundational standards. And of course, if we think about environmental standards, the reality of Europe is if someone starts polluting their river, it's going to be your ocean or your sea or your whatever that's going to suffer. Everyone suffers. We also say yes to reform, really much pushing for reform. And if you want the sort of shorthand on what we mean by reform, it's 180-degree opposite to what David Cameron means about reform. So we want to improve workers' rights, fight against the rules that make it easier for multinationals and harder for small businesses, restructure Europe so it works for those small businesses and people, not for corporations. And also very much Europe is way too centralised. It's a horrible, ugly word, but subsidiarity, which is the principle of decisions being made at the lowest possible level by the people affected, it's in the Lisbon Treaty, we need to make Europe work that way. And finally, we also say yes to a referendum, not because we're particularly calling for it, but we believe in democracy. If it's good enough for the Scots, it's probably good enough for the rest of us.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Yeah, another one behind you.
Oh, sorry.
Could I bring it back to what you said before about exams? First of all, I completely agree. I think exams are really representative of real life. But what would you do about a more mathematical and scientific subject? You can't write an essay on mathematical stuff. So would you leave that exactly the same, or would you introduce a new form of assessment altogether?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily eliminate exams entirely, but they'd be a mixture in terms of the forms of the assessment. And so if you think of science, I did first year physics quite badly a long time ago. But, you might be able to blurt something out in the exam. In fact, if I think back to I did biochemistry, there's a dreadful subject where you learn entire photosynthetic pathways, and you just splurge them down in the exam, remembered it all, forgot it half an hour later. If you actually, learn and understand and they're able to say to explain to someone else, maybe do a presentation in class that explains why this photosynthetic pathway matters, then that's actually a much more useful skill, much more developing you and showing your skills than just that pure exam. I can remember lots of stuff and write it down on a piece of paper really fast. So I think every subject you can develop different ways of testing them, and not necessarily limiting exams entirely, but just making them part of the mix.
Thank you.
Yep. You mentioned Brighton a few times. You said you're the opposition college. Do you have successes? Things you found difficult? Because Brighton is the first question you've got into successes with. Tell us about how that's gone.
Well, I think there's quite an interesting story in terms of Brighton, which is actually live tonight. There's actually a meeting happening tonight, so critical because what we're doing in Brighton is Brighton has actually suffered the worst cuts of any council in the southeast in terms of central government funding, and we've had to operate within that budget envelope and do the best we possibly could. And what we've managed to do is things like we've kept all the children's centres open, we've kept all the branch libraries open. We made the council a living wage council, despite all of the austerity. But what we've actually said is the latest round of cuts from Eric Pickles is just more than we can take. So what we're actually doing is proposing a 4.75% increase in council tax in Brighton next year. Now that will actually require a referendum. So if we're going to get a 4.75 increase in council tax, we have to get a majority of people in the city to vote for it. This is the first time anyone's ever done this. It's obviously a fairly radical move, but what we're aiming to do and what we're saying is, if we don't do this, adult social care is going to have to be slashed to the bone so badly that we're not going to be able to provide decent, dignified care for the people who need it in the city. You know, it simply means that, you know, somebody's grandma is going to have a 15-minute visit in the morning that's supposed to bathe her, dress her, and feed her breakfast when she can't do those things for herself. And so, you know, what we're doing in Brighton at the moment is saying we've got to draw a line under this austerity, the endless cutting back of government. We do need a level of government services that provides a safety net for everyone who needs it. And so, but of course the situation in Brighton is we're only a minority council, so we have to get some other people to vote or at least abstain to get through to the point where we have a referendum. So this is very much a watch this space, because over the next month we'll see what happens. But it's a kind of example of how Greens are prepared to do, you know, things that look like they're going to be unpopular, but say to people, you have a decision. You can choose to spend £5 or £6 a month more on your council tax and make sure that we're providing decent social care. And those are the kind of, you know, grown up politics decisions that we actually need to make. And that's, you know, that's the big thing, issue that's on the agenda at the moment.
Thank you. Alex, question?
Obviously you mentioned how there's you who's the leader, then you have local parties, so those are regional. If there was a local party which did something which was a bit wrong, made a mistake or made some sort of error, would you kind of go and tell that MP off, so to speak?
Well, in short, the Green Party doesn't whip, so we don't tell our MPs how to vote on anything. And in fact, if you're me as leader or Caroline Lucas as MP or anybody, we don't, you know, as the other parties do, if you say something that's not party policy, come down on you like a ton of bricks. What we say is that if you want to say something that's different to party policy, all we ask you to do is to say, well, my personal view on this issue is X, but party policy is that. And that's the way the Green Party operates. And at the same kind of situation is we have nationally agreed policies. So you can look up our policies for a sustainable society, and that all of those policies have been agreed by a national Green Party conference, voted on by a conference, and they're proposed by any 4 members of the party who put forward a proposal and then conference considers it. So we have those policies. A local party might say, well, our local conditions are different and we disagree, and they're sovereign, they can decide what to do. Obviously, if we get to the point where a local party goes absolutely crazy and says it wants to double the number of nuclear weapons or something, then that would come into the bringing the party into disrepute kind of category. We actually want to abolish all the nuclear weapons, for the record. But you know, basically people are free to operate provided they're following green principles, and that's pretty broadly defined. And we understand that, you know, for example, Brighton is asking for a 4.75% council tax increase. Some of our other councillors in different places are saying, well, no, we've got enough money and we're perfectly comfortable with a 0% council tax rise this week. And that reflects different local circumstances. And, you know, we can cope with that. We understand that things are different in different places.
Okay, I mean, I was not quite referring to that, and what I was referring to actually was, and I'm not, you know, criticising you for this, because this was not you, but I heard of a local party which was setting up some sort of groups or something, and they chose the names for these groups were Pumpkin and Mango. Now, in my mind, that's actually quite patronising, because that's the kind of groups you get in lower primary school.
Right, okay.
And it seems that does not seem kind of the way to kind of get, you know, as you were saying earlier, get more votes if you give people patronising group names like Pumpkin and Mango when you're talking about adults here. Kind of what happened and why did that happen?
I don't know what the case you're talking about. I mean, what you do find is it's generally not internal, but certain commentators in the press frequently refer to us as watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside. And then there's various discussions about whether you're a peach or a watermelon. This all happens in the press. And, you know, I quite like fruit salad personally.
Okay, thank you, Christian. Yeah, question from the back?
Hello, I'm not actually a student. I facilitate the Green Ladder project, and we've got quite a few students here tonight who work on the Green Ladder project. I was wondering what advice you would give those students who are very passionate about trying to do something about sustainability and helping to save the environment. If you've got any sort of words of advice, or
I think one of the really important things to do is to make sure you're painting a picture of how what you're doing makes everyone's life better. It's very easy to get labelled as being the Puritan who's saying people shouldn't do things, or who's saying, you know, the classic accusation which I get thrown at all the time, which always amuses me, is, you know, you want people to wear hair shirts and live in caves. And it's like, no. But, you know, so what you need to do is, and that's what I'm trying to do, is very much talk about how, you know, a green society can be a more prosperous society, a society in which everyone's living much better. And, you know, so it's really important if you're making particular practical suggestions or whatever. It's like, for example, I'm talking about insulation. You know, we want warm, comfortable homes. We're not saying turn the heating down. We're saying have a nice, warm, comfortable home and have lower fuel bills at the same time. So it's important to find ways that offers people constructive ways forward, not feeling like they're being deprived or losing something. And I think, you know, if we look in a much more sort of broader philosophical basis, one of the things I talk about a lot is in the future we need to consume a lot less. And, you know, let's be honest about this. This means perhaps, you know, no more flying off to Prague to stag weekends or things like that. Some of those things are simply unsustainable. But, you know, a lot of the reason why people often feel like they need a break, they need to get away from it, is their work is so pressured. You know, they feel so stressed by it all that they feel like they need a break and they've got to take a long weekend somewhere. And, you know, we need to change the workplace so people don't feel so stressed, so overworked. And Green Party policy is to make 35-hour working week as standard. But I'm very attracted by the New Economics Foundation idea of eventually working our way down to a 21-hour working week as standard. And, and it's a quite attractive concept when you think about it. And, you know, at the moment we're chasing after this mad idea of GDP growth. The idea that we have more and more stuff every year. We can't keep having more and more stuff. If we start to think about a trade-off of offering people more and more time, more and more life instead, then you can see why you can trade off, well, I get less stuff, but I have more time in my life. And as Caroline Lucas often says, you know, none of us lies on our deathbed and says, I wish I'd spent more time in the office. Let's live life to the full, really enjoy it, and use less stuff in the process.
Is there a question there? Yep.
Yeah. In regard to your plans to tax the rich more, I was going to ask, do you guys plan on implementing the Robin Hood tax?
Yep, very much so. Although it's interesting because there's different names for this. There's the Robin Hood tax and the Tobin tax. And the Robin Hood tax has behind it the idea that you take this money from trades. So what the idea is, for anyone who doesn't know, for Robin Hood tax or Tobin tax is that each trade that happens in the financial markets, you take a tiny fraction of a percent off it as a tax. Now the Robin Hood tax says take that money and use it to do good things, whether it's helping the poor in your own country or third world aid or whatever, and that's all right. But the Tobin tax has a much stronger idea, which is to make the financial markets much less febrile, much less fast moving. You know, there's something called high frequency trading that occurs at the moment, where people make trades. You know, they make 10 times in 10 trades in the time I can click my fingers. And it's not associated with efficient allocation of resources. It's simply associated with making tiny fractions of money on each trade, and each one makes lots of money. But it also makes the whole situation very volatile. And so the Tobin tax is the idea of set it at a high enough level that you reduce that volatility, reduce the profit to be made from lots of instantaneous trades like that. And so the Tobin tax is what we're very much in favour of.
I was going to ask, I mean, you talked a bit about localism, and you were just giving the example then about people flying to Prague for a weekend or whatever. One of the things that occurred to me is about we live in a global. We're more conscious now that we live in a world and we're all dependent on each other, and so people buying things from Africa or wherever, whilst there might be green miles, fuel miles and things attached to that, that might be supporting an economy elsewhere in the world, and that's an economy that they're dependent on. How does the green policy fit within that sphere, within the global economic spectrum?
I'm going to start with a breakfast I was at in Parliament recently, which was with the UN rapporteur on the right to food, and he was talking about how problems of hunger in the developing world, and saying how decades of neoliberal telling countries global trade is the way to build your wealth, to get out of your poverty, to create situations. That was one of the key contributors to hunger around the world. Because what you have is, particularly in terms of food growing, you have people growing food for export instead of growing food to eat for themselves in their own countries. So what we need to do is develop strong local economies in those places, as well as here, local economies that provide jobs there, that provide food there, that provide money going round and round in those local economies. Export-led economies, is a model that's clearly failed to deliver wealth. I mean, I used to live in Thailand, and so I know Cambodia moderately well. And one of the things that people don't hear about very much, but it's deeply shocking. The Cambodian garment trade is a big part of the Cambodian economy, and the Cambodian garment factories, staffed almost entirely by young women, regularly have cases of mass faintings, whereby hundreds and hundreds of people faint all at once, because they're so hungry that they're not getting enough calories to keep them going, because they can't afford to buy food. The salaries they're paid in those garment factories are simply not enough to actually keep them healthy enough to keep going. And that's no answer, no solution to anyone's future economy, to developing a healthy economy in Cambodia. Cambodia has to develop its own economy, which is not to say that I believe in autarky or anything like everyone just closing in on themselves and not relating at all. I like my coffee, and we're never going to go coffee in Britain. I quite like a banana occasionally, and for example, I'm not carrying it today, but I own a handbag that was made in an Indonesian village by some artisans who turn old bicycle tyres into handbags and sell it to the West for some, what by their standards is an awful lot of money. And that kind of specialist trade that pays people quite well, that uses local skills or local resources or whatever. High value specialised trade is fine, not trying to stop that. But that bulk, environmentally destructive, very low paying kind of trade really isn't benefiting anybody.
Okay. The question I have here is UCLan, as I talked to you about before, we have about 30,000 students, 58% of those live within 50 miles of Preston. So obviously a lot of those students commute. What does the Green Party have in terms of what it would like to do with public transport? That's my question.
Okay, I'll start with the obvious one, which is we're utterly opposed to HS2. And in terms of HS2, there's lots to say, but I'll focus on one point, which is this is on HS2's own figures, and 72% of the journeys on HS2 would be people going into London. HS2 wouldn't help develop the North and the Midlands. It would actually focus resources and money and people even more on London. What we would do instead is first of all start off with the most important transport of all, which is local transport. 58% of the car journeys in Britain are less than 5 miles, which should be walking or cycling journeys by and large. And that means you need to create decent facilities, make people feel safe. If you've got really hilly bits, there's a lot to be thought about promoting electric bicycles, because I know I'm a central London cyclist, I'm not very good at hills, sometimes I need a bit of help. Then continuing on that local transport theme, there's a huge problem with local buses, and we're seeing huge slashing of local bus services, and that's absolutely critical for lots of people to get around, to get to study, to get to jobs. You know, I've heard of cases of people in job centres being sanctioned for not taking a job, but there was no transport that would have got them to the job, so there was no physical way they could do the job because, you know, local bus services have been slashed. And then in terms of railways, again, improving local railways, railways within regions, also very much railways that run east-west across the country, rather than north-south down into London, because lots of those east-west railways are really poor and really slow. So invest in getting people round in their local region, local area and local regions, and you know, that would help to encourage business development. And one of the things I've been talking about a lot in the last day or so is the way that, you know, the huge financial imbalance between London and the North and the Midlands. And you know, we desperately need a regional development policy that develops and allows business to work in these regions. And transport is a really important part of that. And actually one of the other things to talk about is we really these days should talk about transport and communications, because they tie together. And if you look at HS2, the New Economics Foundation did a really good study saying how else might you spend the money instead. And one of their answers was lots of super fast broadband. Because actually, rather than, you know, bringing people together from across the country for a meeting, if you've got really good super fast broadband, you can just do a video conference meeting. Everyone gets to stay at home and tuck their children into bed and, you know, live their life and have the meeting. And so you've replaced transport infrastructure with communications infrastructure.
Okay. Any more questions? Yep, go on then.
I don't know a huge amount of this, just give me some information. When you were saying about the, for instance, the financial sector and the total tax, just so that you can't make the money on these little ways, do you not worry that the financial sector is massive in this country? Do you not just worry that all of these things, whilst they would make it a lovely place to live, they're just going to make us not competitive on the global stage? And then that's going to have the worst effects over time, whereas their answers.
Well, I think there's a couple of things to say about that. First of all, the financial sector is way too massive. And as we saw in 2007 and 8, if the financial sector is too big, and you know, Iceland is the extreme example of this, where if you have too big a financial sector, then you're out of balance with the rest of the country. And the reality is the financial sector employs about 9% of the workforce. But the vast bulk of that employment is actually, you know, the high street branches providing ordinary everyday banking, and you were going to have that no matter what. The amount of employment supplied by the kind of, you know, merchant banking, high level banking that I'm talking about is tiny. And the fact is, you know, we're currently in a situation where 2007-8 could happen again. We've done effectively nothing to make our financial sector, well, very little to make our financial sector more stable. And you know, we can't afford another crash. If you think about the huge social, economic impacts that the last crash had, and think about another crash like that, we simply cannot afford for that to happen. And so we actually have to restructure our economy away from finance towards manufacturing and food growing and all of that. But also the other point is that actually the financial sector is not working even in the things it's supposed to do in terms of providing finance for business. Lending to small business has actually plummeted off a cliff. And I think this is an interesting example. I went to Planet Earth, which is a very high-tech business of growing tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers in big greenhouses with some really interesting technology. It's controversial and it's difficult, but it's this big way of producing lots of food, really quite environmentally friendly. And I was talking to the general manager, and he said he went to all the big British banks and said, I want to build a new greenhouse. give me the finance to build the greenhouse, here's my figures. And the British banks all just reeled back in horror and said, oh, this is horticulture. We don't know anything about horticulture. No, we can't do this. It's risky, don't understand, go away. And so they got the money to fund this big new project that was providing a lot of food and a reasonable amount of pretty bad employment. That's another issue. And they went to a Belgian bank that specialises in horticulture, and they funded it without any great fuss at all. And so we have a financial sector. What the financial sector should be is like a utility. It should be like the water company, like the electricity company, that supplies and manages your money and stores it when you want to, and doesn't break the whole world economy by doing sort of mad gambles. And so we really have to reshape away from that. And I'm always interested by the argument that we're big in the financial sector in Britain because we're really good at it. We're so good at it that we broke the whole global economy.
Okay. I'll go back to the survey for the final question. Again, so with the 800 plus students that we asked, 31.3% believe that the so-called environmental crisis facing humanity has been greatly exaggerated, and 18.2% believe that the effects of climate change are too far in the future to worry about. And just asked by us, what would you say to those people?
Well, you know what I'm going to say is a green, but I'm actually going to quote two people in response to that. One of whom is Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, who I'm sure is a very nice man, but not generally known as environmentalist. And he said after the IPCC report came out, he said, the heat is on, we must act now. So that's what the UN Secretary General, the person who's given the task of having an overview of the general state of the world, said. And I'll also go to Christine Lagarde, who's the head of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, who's probably even less of what you think of as a green. And she was asked by some journalists to say what was the thing that kept her awake at night. What was the issue that she really felt worried about and felt we weren't dealing with? And she said, we're not doing enough about climate change. So there's two people who are not by anyone's definition greens, two people who have a big strategic overview of the state of the world, and they're saying we need to act now. So, listen to them, listen to the climate scientists, and recognise that 97% of climate scientists agree with the IPCC report. And that's the best information, the best evidence we have. And that's one of the things of the Green Party is whether it's this, whether it's drugs policy, whether it's health policy, whether it's a whole range of things, we believe in basing the policy on the evidence. And the evidence on climate change is overwhelming.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, if we could all give a round of applause. And thank you.